The alley behind the Quick Mart wasn't supposed to feel dangerous. It was early evening, the kind of hour when the sky still held onto a thin blue light and the city pretended it was calm. But the air back there told a different story. Wet concrete, old garbage, spilled beer, and the metallic tang of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Officer Daniel Mason stood near his cruiser, posture relaxed but eyes trained forward. He'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were the quiet ones. Beside him sat Rex, a broad-chested German shepherd with a black and tan coat that gleamed even in poor light. Rex wasn't packing or barking. He sat perfectly still, tail low, ears angled forward, not alert like a rookie K9 but focused, like something had already been decided. Mason checked his watch. Noise complaint, 3 calls in 20 minutes, same location. Down the alley, 3 men leaned against a brick wall, laughing too loudly, the sound bouncing and twisting between dumpsters. Empty bottles lay near their feet. One of them kicked a can, sending it skittering across the pavement until it clanged softly against Rex's paw. Rex didn't move. That should have been the warning. "Hey," Mason called out, firm but controlled. "Let's keep it moving, gentlemen." One of the men turned. Mid-20s, thick jacket, the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. His eyes slid past Mason's badge and locked onto Rex. "Yo," he laughed, nudging his friend. "Check out the size of that thing." The second man grinned. "Police dog, huh? Bet he's all bark." Rex's eyes followed them. No growl, no tension on the leash. Just that steady, unsettling stare, as if he were measuring distance, angles, options. Mason felt it then, that subtle shift in the air, the instinct that whispered this could go wrong fast. "Hands where I can see them," Mason said. They half listened. The third man, taller, heavier, took a step closer, too close. "You really gonna sick him on us?" he scoffed. Before Mason could respond, the first man swung his foot, not a kick, not fully, but enough to shove Rex's shoulder. A careless motion, a joke to him. The sound of the boot brushing fur was quiet. But it landed like a gunshot. Time slowed. Rex's body stiffened, not explosively, not violently, just a subtle tightening like a coiled cable being drawn taut. His ears flattened a fraction. His jaw closed harder. His breathing changed. Mason's hand dropped instantly toward the leash. "Hey, back up now." The men laughed, mistaking stillness for submission. Across the street, beyond the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp, a man walking alone stopped dead. He had been moving fast, hood up, head down, one hand in his pocket, just another passerby, forgettable, invisible. Until he saw the dog. His foot froze mid-step. His eyes narrowed, sharp and immediate, not confused, not curious. Recognizing. The patch on Rex's collar caught the light, small, worn, stitched low enough that most people never noticed it. Not a city insignia, not standard issue. The man's jaw tightened. In the alley, the second man leaned forward, grinning. "What, he broken or someth?" The first man shoved Rex again, harder this time. Mason reacted instantly, yanking the leash back. "That's enough." Rex slid half a step, then planted. His paws dug into the pavement, not resisting Mason. Waiting. The bystander across the street exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath that barely fogged the air. His shoulders squared beneath the hoodie, posture changing in a way that didn't belong to civilians. His gaze never left Rex. 7 years vanished in a blink. Sand, road or wash, gunfire echoing through narrow corridors, a weight at his side, fast and fearless, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. Not yet, he thought. In the alley, one of the men laughed again, louder now, feeding off his friend's reactions. "See, told you, dog don't even care." Rex's eyes shifted briefly away from the men. Across the street. Their gazes locked. The connection was instant, electric. Rex's tail twitched once almost imperceptibly, his ears lifted a fraction higher. Mason felt it through the leash, a change so subtle he couldn't explain it, only feel it, like the dog had just checked in with someone else. "All right," Mason said, voice hardening. "Turn around, all of you, hands on the wall." The tall man in the hoodie took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. He whispered, barely audible, not meant for anyone else. "Easy, boy." Rex didn't move. The men didn't hear the words, but Rex did. The first man scoffed and took another step toward the dog, lifting his foot again, this time not joking. Mason's heart jumped. "Don't." Rex's muscles tensed fully now, power coiled beneath discipline. The leash pulled tight in Mason's grip as the dog leaned forward, not attacking, not yet, but ready. The tall man stopped at the edge of the light, eyes cold, voice calm. "Take your foot off the dog." Something in his tone cut through the noise, the laughter, the false bravado. The men hesitated, confused by the authority they couldn't explain. The first man sneered anyway, or what? The bystander's gaze flicked down to Rex's collar, then back up. "Or you're going to learn," he said quietly, "why that dog hasn't bitten you yet." Rex's breathing slowed. Waiting. Because this wasn't a police stop to him. It was a reunion. And one wrong move would unlock everything he'd been trained to hold back. The alley went still. Not quiet exactly. The usual urban noises, a distant siren, the hum of traffic, a dog barking blocks away continued. But in that narrow stretch behind Quickmart, time seemed to pause. 3 men stared at Rex and the tall stranger across the street, uncertain whether to laugh, fight, or flee. Rex's muscles were like steel springs. His eyes flicked from Mason to the men, then to the figure across the street. He had never been this calm before a confrontation. Mason had trained him, yes, but there had always been a margin of chaos in Rex. Now there was none. The tall man took a single step forward. Hood shadowed most of his face, but his eyes burned with the cold precision of someone who had faced death more times than most people had counted. Mason felt a shiver run down his spine, not fear, not awe, but recognition. He didn't know this man, yet something in his posture screamed authority. He whispered a single word, just one. "Hold." It barely left his lips, but Rex heard it. His ears twitched, his tail lowered slightly, yet his body did not relax. It was restraint so precise, so practiced, it was almost terrifying. The men noticed nothing. They thought they were still in control. "See, nothing," the tallest of them jeered, laughing too loudly. He kicked a loose brick toward Rex, expecting the dog to flinch. Rex didn't flinch. The brick rolled to his side, harmless. But in the split second it stopped, his stance changed. Subtle, almost invisible. A predator ready to strike, but waiting. Mason tightened his grip on the leash, realizing he could barely control the animal in front of him. Not because Rex wanted to attack, but because he had another master. One whose authority Rex recognized instantly. The men leaned in, emboldened. One of them reached down, hand trembling slightly, and poked Rex's side again. "Dude, what's wrong with this mutt?" He laughed nervously. "He's like broken or something." The tall man across the street stepped fully into the alley's dim light now. Mason saw it clearly. His body was coiled, ready to move at the speed of thought. A faint scar ran along his jaw, disappearing under his hoodie. His hands were relaxed, but every muscle in his frame betrayed years of training, of survival under fire. "Leave him alone," he said, voice low and smooth. Calm but carrying weight, authority that didn't need a badge. The men froze. One laughed nervously, but the others looked at each other, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They didn't recognize the danger, but they felt it, a quiet, undeniable pressure. The tallest man, the one who had kicked Rex, snorted. "Or what? What's he gonna do, bite me?" Rex's gaze shifted to the man's foot. A slight growl rumbled from deep in his throat, not loud, not threatening, but enough to make the three men pause. Mason swallowed hard. He knew that growl. Rex wasn't just a police dog. Not tonight, not with this man watching. Now, the tall man's voice was sharper this time, a command carried on a calm wind that left no room for negotiation. Rex's muscles coiled. He leaned back slightly on Mason's leash, perfect obedience, yet the tension radiated from him. His eyes never left the man's foot. The threat was clear, the warning unmistakable. One more move and there would be consequences. The tallest man who had been mocking Rex shifted his weight, reconsidering. The other two glanced around nervously, uncertainty growing in their eyes. Mason's heart pounded in his chest. He trained dogs for years, but never one like this. This was beyond a K9. This was a partner who had seen war, who had followed orders that were life or death, and now, some instinct deep within him, was telling Mason something he didn't yet understand. "You don't even know him," Mason said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The tall man's eyes flicked to Mason, and Mason felt a flicker of recognition there. Something like, "You understand. You know what this means." Then the tallest man reached for something in his pocket. Mason tensed, thinking of a weapon, but the man only pulled out a small, worn badge, pressed it against his palm, and let the light catch it briefly. Mason leaned forward, squinting. The insignia was unfamiliar, military, special forces, elite. Rex's tail twitched slightly. Mason felt it. The dog knew this man. The three men, sensing the shift in the air, laughed nervously, trying to mask their fear. "Whatever, man," the shortest one said. "It's just a dog, you're." A sudden, subtle movement from the tall man silenced them. He raised two fingers, a small, precise hand signal. The type of signal Mason had only seen in old military documentaries, in stories from handlers who worked in elite units. Rex froze completely, not aggression, not retreat, control, pure disciplined control. Mason felt his stomach drop. The dog was listening to someone else, someone who wasn't him. The men looked at each other, confused. What? The tall man's eyes never left the one man's foot. "One more step," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension, "and you'll regret it." The man laughed weakly, trying to keep the bravado alive. He didn't move his foot, yet. Mason could see the beads of sweat forming at the nape of his neck. Rex's ears flicked toward the man across the street, then back at the foot. Every muscle in his body was ready, waiting for a command only he would obey. Mason realized then, with a chill running down his spine, that Rex wasn't just a police dog tonight. He was a war dog, and the man who had just appeared out of nowhere was his handler. One wrong move from these three men, and no one in the alley would walk away unscathed. And somewhere deep inside Rex's old instincts, the kind honed in the deserts and ruins of far-off lands, under fire, beside a man he had trusted with his life, began to awaken. The three men had no idea the danger standing mere feet from them. And Mason knew, with a sinking feeling, that the night was about to escalate in ways none of them could imagine. Because Rex wasn't just waiting for police orders. He was waiting for his handler's silent command to decide who lived and who learned a lesson the hard way. The air in the alley hung heavy, thick with tension, and the faint metallic scent of rain about to fall. The three men in front of Officer Mason shifted uneasily, still unsure if the danger was real or if it was just a bluff. Their bravado, which had carried them this far, was starting to crack like old paint. "Seriously, back up," Mason barked again, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Something beyond his control had entered the scene, something he could feel in every taut muscle of Rex beside him. And then someone in the crowd, an ordinary bystander just as startled as Mason, noticed it first. Her hand went to her mouth. Is that a military patch?" she whispered to no one in particular. Her voice trembled with a mix of awe and fear. Mason glanced down at Rex's collar, then back at the woman. At first he thought she was seeing things, but then he realized there it was, almost hidden beneath Rex's police badge. A small, frayed insignia stitched into the thick leather of his collar. Not city-issued, not standard K9. Military. The realization hit Mason like a punch to the gut. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. His eyes scanned the street, and there it was, the tall man who had silently commanded Rex. The man's hood was still up, but his posture had changed. He wasn't moving, not even a muscle, but the aura of authority radiating from him was undeniable. Mason had trained with elite K9 units before, but he had never seen anything like this. Never a dog so fully obedient to someone other than himself. Rex, meanwhile, had shifted just a fraction, still tense, still ready. His focus had changed subtly from the three men in front of him to the figure across the street. Mason could see the connection. The bond between dog and handler was instantaneous, absolute, unspoken. "Take your foot off the dog," the tall man said again, calm and low. His voice was the kind that made a man stop and think, even if he didn't want to. The tallest of the three men laughed nervously, shoving Rex one more time, thinking he was being funny. "Or what, old man?" he scoffed. "You gonna what?" Rex's head lifted slightly, eyes narrowing. There was a subtle growl deep in his throat, a low, guttural sound that carried an almost human intelligence. Mason felt it resonate through the leash. This wasn't just warning, this was calculated restraint. The tall man's eyes flicked toward Mason, and Mason understood immediately. This was not a man who needed the law to enforce obedience. This was someone who had trained life and death into this dog. Suddenly, the shortest of the three men noticed the patch. His eyes went wide, mouth opening, but nothing came out. "Wait, is that military?" he stammered, voice cracking. That's not." The tall man raised a hand slightly, fingers forming a silent signal. Mason had seen hand signals in training before, but this one was different, fluid, precise, and instinctively followed by Rex. The dog's body coiled like a spring. His eyes remained locked on the man who had kicked him, tail lowered but rigid, muscles ready. Mason felt a tension so sharp in his grip that he almost yelped. The dog wasn't going to attack yet, but one wrong move from these men and it would be catastrophic. The tallest man took a step back, suddenly uncertain. This is insane," he said, sweat forming at his temples. He glanced at his friends, eyes wide. "He's just a dog." Rex's growl grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. It wasn't aggression for aggression's sake. It was a warning honed over years in the battlefield, the kind that meant, "I will act if you make the next mistake." The tall man across the street took a slow step forward, and Mason could see it now, clear as day. His jacket pulled tight across his chest, scars faintly visible along his jaw and forearm. Eyes cold, calculating, unyielding. He had been through situations that made most people crumble, and Mason realized something terrifying. He had been in more danger in the past than Mason could even imagine. Rex's ears flicked toward the man, then back to the foot of the tallest offender. Mason's chest tightened. The dog's training, his discipline, his restraint, everything pointed to one simple truth. The man in the street was Rex's true handler. The dog's allegiance was clear. A low whistle escaped the crowd, someone trying to break the tension. But Mason ignored it. His focus was on the silent exchange between dog and handler, the invisible bond that had just taken over the alley. The first man, emboldened or foolish, lifted his foot again, testing the waters. "What's he gonna do? Huh, bite me?" he laughed, nervous, forcing humor where there was none. In response, the tall man made another subtle movement, almost imperceptible to everyone but Rex. The dog tensed, muscles locking. In a flash, Mason felt the danger ripple through the leash. He could no longer control the dog, not because Rex wanted to attack, but because he had another master now. The tallest man froze mid-step. Mason's stomach dropped. He realized the lesson about to unfold would not just be about respect, it would be about survival. And then, like a ghost from another world, the patch on Rex's collar caught the dim light. It told a story none of the men in the alley could understand. "Special Forces," Mason whispered. "He's Special Forces retired, that dog." Rex's eyes narrowed further. A growl rolled up from deep in his chest. The tension coiled tighter. Mason could feel it in his hands, in his shoulders, in his heartbeat. One more shove from the tallest man, one more careless step toward the dog, and the consequences would be immediate. Mason took a deep breath. He glanced at the tall stranger across the street. Who are you?" he asked quietly. The man's hood fell back slightly as he stepped forward. The scars along his face and hands were no longer hidden. His eyes were cold steel. He exhaled slowly, like a man preparing for battle, though no weapon was drawn. "I'm the one who taught him everything he knows," the man said, his voice low and steady. "And I don't make mistakes." The three men, finally realizing the weight of the situation, froze. They glanced at each other. Confusion, fear, respect, it all mingled in their wide eyes. Rex shifted slightly, just enough for Mason to feel the electricity in the leash. He was ready, waiting, patient, controlled. The tall man's eyes locked with Rex. That single, wordless command was all it took. The dog's body relaxed fractionally, but not fully. The message was clear: you will act only on my signal. And Mason understood, fully and terrifyingly. Tonight, Rex was no longer just a police dog. He was a weapon finely tuned, loyal not to the badge, but to the man who had raised him from puppyhood, trained him through war, and trusted him with his life. The three men would find out soon enough. One wrong move, and nothing would be the same. The crowd held its breath. The rain began to patter softly on the asphalt. And in the shadows of that alley, a silent war was about to begin. The rain that began to fall in the alley outside Quickmart mirrored a storm from 7 years ago. A storm far more violent, far more dangerous, in a place where survival wasn't guaranteed. The sounds of the city faded, replaced in Mason's mind by echoes of desert sand shifting under armored boots, the whine of helicopter rotors overhead, and the staccato rhythm of gunfire that had once been Rex's constant companion. Back then, the dog wasn't called Rex, not officially. To his handler, he was simply partner, and the man who now stood across the street in a hoodie, the one commanding silent obedience, was younger, faster, sharper. A Special Forces operative whose life had been defined by split-second decisions, fire fights, and the kind of discipline that could turn fear into a weapon. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, hot enough to make metal burn through gloves. Sand clung to every surface, dusted uniforms and rifles alike. The operative crouched behind the low wall of a half-collapsed building, hand resting on the stock of his weapon, eyes scanning the horizon. Beside him, partner moved silently, a shadow perfectly in sync. Every muscle in the dog's body coiled with precision, every movement calculated, every step in perfect rhythm with the man's heartbeat. Explosions rocked the compound ahead. Concrete cracked, dust and debris filled the air. Civilians had been evacuated, or so they thought, but intel suggested insurgents had hidden reinforcements. One wrong move, and the team would be walking into a trap. "Stay sharp," the operative whispered. Not to the men in the unit, not to anyone else, but to partner. The dog's ears twitched, his amber eyes locked on the operatives. That was enough. No leash. No command beyond the single word spoken months ago in a training yard far away. They had worked for weeks in perfect silence, building a bond stronger than any chain. Inside the building, movement. Shadowed figures, armed, moving like predators. Partner slinked low, silent as the wind. The operative's heart raced, but outwardly he was calm, always calm. He gave a subtle hand signal, and partner was in motion, clearing the first room with the precision of a ghost. Each target neutralized with efficiency, no hesitation. A sudden gunshot ripped through the wall behind them. The operative dove to cover, heart pounding. Partner was there instantly, nudging him toward a safer angle. They moved as one, breath synchronized, eyes locked on the danger. A grenade rolled toward them. Partner lunged, biting at the pin with practiced force, tossing it back just as it detonated. The explosion rocked the building, sending shrapnel across the room, but both survived unscathed. "Good boy," the operative muttered under his breath. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement, bond, trust, the kind that only comes when lives have been saved more than once by each other. Hours later, after the firefight ended and smoke cleared, the team regrouped. Partner sat by the operative's side, calm as if nothing had happened. Yet his eyes were alive, scanning the horizon, alert for threats that no longer existed. That night, as the desert wind howled through makeshift tents, the operative knelt by the dog. His hand ran over the thick fur, smoothing away the dust and grime. "You're the best partner I've ever had," he said quietly. "Don't ever forget that. We're a team. Always." But fate had its own plans. Orders came to recall the operative. He had been wounded in the firefight, reassigned, sent home. Partner couldn't come with him, not officially. He was transferred to a local K-9 unit trained to serve in law enforcement. But the bond was never broken. The handler kept tabs, knowing the dog's skills were too valuable, the connection too strong to simply vanish. Back in the alley in the present, Mason saw the resemblance immediately. The way the man moved, controlled, deliberate. The subtle gestures he made, the invisible leash of authority he held over Rex. Mason realized fully now why the dog had never reacted to the drunken shoves. It wasn't police training alone. It was war training. Years of life-or-death situations that forged discipline beyond anything city limits could ever teach. The tallest of the three men, emboldened by ignorance, stepped toward Rex again. Mason's heart pounded. "Don't," he warned. But his words were redundant. Rex's body was already coiled, ready, waiting, but restrained. The man across the street took a slow step forward. No hurry, no panic, just a presence that radiated power. Mason felt the hairs on his arms rise. He realized in that moment, one command from this stranger and Rex would be unstoppable. The first man shoved Rex again. Mistake. Rex's growl was low, deadly, resonating from deep within his chest. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the alley like a warning bell. The men stumbled backward, eyes wide, panic flickering across their faces. "Last warning," the handler said softly, almost a whisper, but Mason could see the effect immediately. The men froze, understanding instinctively that this was not a threat to be taken lightly. Mason's mind raced. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize training, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He saw clearly now that Rex had another master, someone whose authority was absolute, someone whose presence demanded obedience, even from a dog who had been trained to follow Mason himself. The rain picked up, falling in thin, steady streams. Water pooled on the asphalt, reflecting the alley lights like molten silver. The three men shivered, not from the cold, but from the sudden realization that they were outmatched in ways they didn't understand. Rex's eyes flicked between the men and the handler. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready, restrained. Mason realized something frighteningly simple. One more shove, one more misstep, and the consequences would be immediate, severe, and unstoppable. The tall man took another step forward, hood pulled back further. His face was illuminated in the flickering streetlight. Scarred, calm, unreadable. The kind of face that had stared down death in foreign lands and survived. Mason swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. The men didn't. And that realization made him sick. Rex shifted slightly, just enough for Mason to feel the electricity in the leash. Every instinct, every memory of battle, every ounce of training within the dog was now focused, directed, and ready. The past had returned, and the alley was about to become a proving ground for skills honed on battlefields half a world away. A test the men in front of them weren't ready for. Mason took a deep breath. The handler's eyes met his across the wet asphalt. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Because tonight, Rex was no longer just a police dog. He was a war veteran. And Mason knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the night had only just begun. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the asphalt and bouncing off the alley walls in chaotic metallic echoes. The three men who had been laughing just minutes ago now shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Rex and the tall stranger across the street. Fear had begun to replace their bravado, but they hadn't yet grasped the full weight of the danger surrounding them. The tallest man, who had shoved Rex multiple times, stepped forward again. Mason felt a cold wave of dread. He reached toward his radio but stopped. It didn't matter what he did. The situation had evolved beyond police procedures. This was no longer a city confrontation. This was a war dog at the peak of its capability, and the man across the street was the only one who could call him off. The tall man's hood fell back fully, revealing his face in the flickering streetlight. Scars, fine lines, a hardened expression shaped by years of combat and survival. He didn't flinch, didn't shout. He simply raised two fingers in a deliberate, precise gesture. Rex responded instantly. It was subtle at first. A shift of weight, a slight lean, muscles tightening. And then, with the coiled energy of a predator that had waited its whole life for the right moment, Rex moved. In 2 heartbeats, the tallest man was on the ground, his wrist locked painfully behind his back. He screamed, more in shock than pain, as Rex's powerful jaw pressed firmly, but without breaking skin, against the crook of his elbow. The other 2 men stumbled back in terror. The second tried to grab Rex's leash, thinking he could somehow wrest control from Mason. But Mason had barely enough time to react before the tall stranger across the street made another subtle movement. Rex obeyed instantly, releasing the first man and pivoting gracefully to block the next threat. Officer Mason's hand hovered near his sidearm, heart racing. He had trained for K-9 operations, but he had never seen anything like this. The dog wasn't attacking recklessly. He was precise, controlled, lethal in the way only a war-trained animal could be. Mason realized with a cold clarity that Rex's obedience was no longer to him, but to his handler across the street. Every movement, every decision, was perfectly synchronized with the man who had appeared out of nowhere. The 3 men, eyes wide with terror, tried to retreat. The alley was narrow, no escape route except the way they had come. Their boots slipped on the slick asphalt as the rain increased. Mason could hear their panicked breaths, the frantic slap of water as they stumbled. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," the tall man said quietly, almost conversationally, as if describing a fact that should have been obvious. His eyes never left Rex, and the dog's gaze was locked in perfect alignment. "You touched him, you disrespected him, and you had no idea what you were dealing with." The first man whimpered, trying to crawl away, but Rex anticipated his movement instantly. A light, controlled pressure on the man's shoulder pushed him back to the ground. Mason saw the terror on his face, real, palpable, and justified. The second man fumbled with his jacket, trying to pull out his phone. "I am calling," he stammered. Rex reacted faster than Mason had ever thought possible. He moved with fluid speed, landing in front of the man, ears pinned slightly, eyes narrowed. Not a bark, not a growl, just a silent, commanding presence that froze the man in place. Mason felt the heat of adrenaline rush through him. This dog had trained for moments like this, and he had waited his entire life to be unleashed with perfect control. The tall man raised his voice slightly, calm but unyielding. "Stop, now." Rex obeyed immediately, stepping aside but maintaining an unmistakable aura of dominance. The second man froze, staring at the dog, sweat dripping down his temple, realizing he was powerless. The third man, the shortest of the group, made a desperate attempt to escape down the alley, slipping and sliding on the wet pavement. But Rex was already moving, faster than thought, intercepting him before he could reach the end. The dog pinned him gently but firmly against a wall, tail low, muscles tight, eyes locked on his prey. Officer Mason's jaw went dry. His hands shook slightly as he watched the precision and discipline of this animal. The three men had underestimated the dog, underestimated the handler, and underestimated the lethal combination of years of military training applied to a creature that was as intelligent as it was powerful. The crowd that had gathered at the edge of the alley gasped. Some tried to step back, uncertain whether to intervene or flee. Mason realized that no one could interfere without risking injury. This was no ordinary police incident. The tall man stepped into the alley, his calm presence commanding attention. He knelt slightly beside Rex, resting a hand on the dog's thick neck. "Release," he said. In perfect obedience, Rex stepped back from the third man, settling down quietly but still exuding a presence that screamed warning. "Do not move." The three men, now fully subdued and terrified, didn't need to be told what to do. They raised their hands, scrambling to comply. The tallest man, clutching his wrist, glared up at Rex, a mixture of fear and awe in his eyes. Officer Mason finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Who are you?" he asked quietly, still staring at the man who had just commanded a war-trained dog like a shadow of death and mercy combined. The tall man exhaled slowly, standing up and brushing the rain off his jacket. "I'm his handler," he said simply, voice calm but firm. "The one who taught him everything he knows, and you all just learned a very expensive lesson about respect." Mason glanced at Rex, who had returned his focus to him, sitting obediently, tail low but alert. The dog's eyes flicked once toward the street where his handler had come from, a flicker of recognition that only they could understand. The men on the ground were shaking, their bravado shattered. Every instinct told them that their arrogance had nearly cost them far more than embarrassment. The tall man crouched briefly, meeting Mason's eyes. "Take care of him," he said. "He's more than a K9, he's a soldier." Before Mason could respond, the man stood and turned, slipping back into the shadows of the wet city street. Rex's gaze followed him for a heartbeat before returning to Mason, calm again, obedient, but the weight of his experience still radiated from every muscle. The three men would remember this night forever. They had laid a foot on a dog they thought was just a city K9. They had no idea it belonged to someone who had trained him in battle, forged a bond in war, and could unleash that power with a whisper. Mason exhaled, rain dripping from his hair onto his uniform. He reached down and patted Rex's head. "You're unbelievable," he murmured. The dog leaned into his hand, eyes steady, calm. But Mason knew that calm was earned, that restraint was learned, and that tonight had proven just how lethal and disciplined Rex truly was. In the alley, the night resumed its rhythm. Rain continued to fall. But for Mason, and for anyone who had witnessed it, the city felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier, charged with the memory of precision, power, and a bond forged in places where most people feared to step. The lesson had been delivered. The warning had been given. And for the three men on the ground, nothing would ever feel the same again. The rain poured steadily now, transforming the alley into a slick, reflective canvas of city lights. The three men were huddled together on the ground, soaked and trembling, their bravado completely evaporated. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but the realization had set in. They had just crossed a line they couldn't take back. Officer Mason stepped forward cautiously, his eyes flicking between Rex and the tall stranger who had so effortlessly commanded the dog. The man's presence was magnetic, almost unreal, yet undeniably dangerous. Mason's fingers hovered over his radio, ready to call for backup, but something told him it wasn't necessary. Not yet. The tall man approached slowly, his movements deliberate. Rain dripped from his hair and jacket, but he appeared untouched by the chaos of the moment. His gaze locked onto Mason. "You're wondering who I am," he said, voice calm, low, unshakable. Mason nodded, still trying to process everything. "Yeah, I mean, you controlled him, you." "I'm his handler," the man interrupted, finishing the sentence Mason hadn't known how to frame. I trained him from a pup, not just for police work but for things far beyond the city limits. Combat, search and rescue, recon. He's seen more in his life than you and these gentlemen could imagine. Rex sat at his side, calm, obedient, but Mason noticed a subtle tension in the dog's shoulders, the kind of alertness that said, I know him. I trust him. Mason's mind raced back to the insignia on Rex's collar. Special Forces, he asked quietly. The man nodded. Retired Special Forces. I don't carry a badge anymore, but I carry the knowledge of what this dog can do, and I carry the responsibility for him. The three men on the ground swallowed hard, eyes wide, realizing for the first time that their lives had just brushed with something beyond ordinary comprehension. The tallest one, wrist still sore from Rex's grip, stammered, "Why you're military?" The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, and that dog," he said, glancing at Rex, "is a soldier in his own right. You assaulted him, you disrespected him, you thought he was just an animal. You were wrong." The second man tried to protest, voice shaky. "We didn't know it was just a—" "You did know it was a police dog," the handler interrupted sharply. "That's enough to understand consequences. You're lucky this is where it ends tonight. You're lucky the law caught up with you before Rex decided to escalate." Mason swallowed. He had seen a lot in his career, but this was unlike anything else. He glanced down at Rex, who was calm again, obediently following the handler's every subtle cue. Mason realized the truth. This dog wasn't just trained. He was conditioned for battle, for obedience under extreme stress, and for lethal efficiency if commanded. The tall man's eyes swept over the three men one final time. "Cuff them," he said to Mason. "Make sure they understand exactly what they did." Mason nodded, stepping forward as he reached for his cuffs. The men, wet, shaking, and defeated, raised their hands in surrender. There was no bravado left, only fear and remorse. As Mason secured the first man, the handler crouched slightly to Rex's level. His hand stroked the dog's neck, firm but gentle. "Good boy," he murmured. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes softening slightly, though the fire in them never fully dimmed. A siren wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of backup. Mason exhaled slowly. I'm going to need to explain this," he said, glancing back at the three men. "They assaulted a police dog multiple times. They're in real trouble." The handler nodded, standing tall again. "Good, let them understand, but more importantly," he paused, looking at Mason, "let them understand that some lessons aren't just learned in court. Some are learned in experience, and tonight they learned one they won't forget." The rain splashed around them as Mason radioed for additional units. As he spoke, the first man, still on the wet asphalt, muttered under his breath, "I didn't know, I had no idea." "You should have," the handler said quietly, his eyes cutting into the man's like steel. "Respect isn't optional, especially when you're dealing with someone trained for life and death and his partner." Backup arrived moments later. Officers moved efficiently, taking statements, securing the scene, and finally leading the three men to waiting patrol vehicles. The crowd that had gathered remained silent, watching as a real-life legend had unfolded before their eyes. Mason could feel their awe, their uncertainty. Finally, the tall man turned toward Mason. "Take care of him," he said simply, gesturing to Rex. "He's more than a K9. He's a soldier and he deserves to be treated as such. Keep him safe, train him well, and never underestimate the bond you share with him." Mason nodded, swallowing hard. I will." Without another word, the handler turned and disappeared into the night, his figure blending into the shadows of the rainy street. Rex's ears flicked toward the fatting figure, tail lowering slightly, eyes still alert. He had recognized his master, and Mason realized fully now that the dog's loyalty was unshakable. As the rain continued to fall, Mason knelt beside Rex, letting his hands run over the wet fur. "You're incredible," he murmured. The dog leaned in slightly, obedient calm, yet still radiating the quiet power that had just silenced 3 men and commanded the respect of everyone watching. Mason looked back toward the patrol vehicles, the 3 men now secured. He understood the gravity of what had just happened. These men had underestimated a dog and the bond forged in combat that no city ordinance could replicate. They had learned a lesson in humility, fear, and respect. The alley, once just another slice of city life, now felt charged, alive with the echo of events that would be retold countless times in whispered rumors. The night had changed something fundamental. Everyone there knew it. Rex nudged Mason gently, and he realized the dog was ready to move, ready to continue his duty. Mason gave a nod of acknowledgement. The city had its laws, its rules, but tonight had proven something else entirely. Some forces of law and loyalty could not be measured by badges alone. And the world had just witnessed one of those forces in action. The handler was gone, the men were taken into custody, but Mason knew one thing. Rex's past was alive, powerful, and ever-present. The dog wasn't just a partner. He was a legend, forged in war, tempered by loyalty and unbreakable under any threat. The night would remember this. Mason would remember this. And for the 3 men who had crossed the line, their fear would be eternal. Because they had just come face to face with the true meaning of discipline, power, and respect, and it had come on 4 legs, and the eyes of a man who had survived war itself. The alley had settled into an eerie calm. Rain continued to fall in sheets, soaking the pavement and creating shallow pools that reflected the flashing lights of patrol cars. The 3 men were now secured in the back of a police cruiser, still trembling, still processing the events that had unfolded, events that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Officer Mason adjusted Rex's leash, feeling the dog's muscles tense and relax in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The dog had returned to obedient calm, but Mason knew better than to assume the threat was over. Rex's instincts were honed for war, for chaos, and Mason had learned the hard way that even a quiet moment could erupt into danger. And it did. A shout came from the edge of the alley. Mason's head whipped toward the sound just as a man, one of the accomplices who had fled before the confrontation, bolted from a side street. He had obviously been hiding nearby, hopping to avoid the police entirely. But fate had other plans. "Stop!" Mason shouted, but the man didn't hear him. He was too fast, too desperate, adrenaline fueling his every step. Rex's ears twitched. A low growl vibrated through his chest, almost imperceptible, but Mason felt it in the grip of his gloves. The dog's eyes narrowed, focused, calculating. This was no longer a training scenario or a simple arrest. This was the real deal, a fleeing suspect, armed with his own panic, against a war-trained K-9 whose every sense was heightened to deadly precision. Mason froze for a heartbeat, knowing that trying to intercept the man himself would be reckless. Rex, however, moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. Without a command, without hesitation, the dog launched into action. The man tried to change direction. Hopping the slick pavement would help him slip away. He slipped slightly, but Rex anticipated the movement, pivoting mid-stride, cutting off any chance of escape. In a blur, Rex was in front of the man, forcing him to a halt. The dog's presence alone was enough to freeze him in place. The authority, the power, the absolute control over the situation. "Good boy," Mason whispered, though it was hardly necessary. He knew this was Rex's domain now. The dog's loyalty, his training, and his instincts had taken over. The man dropped to his knees, hands raised instinctively, trying to reason with a creature he didn't understand. I'm not going back. I didn't do anything. Rex's gaze held him in place, unwavering. His body language said everything the man needed to hear. One wrong move and it will end badly. Obey or face consequences. Mason felt a chill as he realized the full scale of Rex's capabilities. He was watching a dog that had been trained for the chaos of war, a dog whose handler had prepared him for life-and-death scenarios, a dog who understood commands that transcended language. Every movement was precise, every choice calculated. The tall handler from earlier appeared at the edge of the scene, emerging from the shadows as if summoned. Mason's heart skipped a beat. He had expected him to vanish entirely into the night. Instead, he arrived at the perfect moment, watching the chase unfold with calm, assessing every angle. "Easy," the handler said softly to Rex, a single word that carried all the authority in the world. The dog paused, breathing steady, yet still in full control of the situation. The fleeing man remained kneeling, frozen, utterly aware of the intelligence and power of the creature before him. The handler stepped closer. "Release," he commanded. Rex obeyed immediately, stepping back but maintaining a subtle, unyielding presence. The man exhaled shakily, realizing he wasn't being attacked, but understanding implicitly that his narrow escape had been controlled entirely by Rex's judgment. The dog wasn't reckless. He was measured, lethal efficiency contained within restraint. Mason approached cautiously. He could have. The handler shook his head. That's the point. It wasn't about causing harm. It was about control, about judgment, about understanding the power that comes with training, experience, and trust. He crouched slightly, resting his hand on Rex's wet fur. This is more than obedience. This is partnership. Every life, every choice, every second matters. He knows that, and I trust him completely. Rex nudged Mason gently, reminding him that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the responsibility he carried as the dog's police handler was immense. Mason realized in that moment that he wasn't just supervising a K9. He was responsible for a creature shaped by war, guided by instinct, and loyal only to those he trusted. The fleeing man was led away by backup officers, visibly shaken, soaking wet, and utterly subdued. He would face charges, of course, but the real lesson had been delivered in the alley, in the rain, in the undeniable presence of Rex and his handler. Mason looked at the dog, feeling a deep respect, almost awe. "You're incredible," he murmured. Rex leaned slightly into his touch, obedient, calm, but Mason knew the fire within him hadn't diminished. It had only been restrained, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The handler stood and turned to Mason, rain streaming down his face, a calm but commanding presence. "Take care of him," he said simply. "Keep him sharp, keep him disciplined. And remember, a dog like this is not just a tool. He's a partner, a warrior, a guardian. Treat him as such." The handler vanished into the rainy night once more, leaving Mason alone with Rex. The city resumed its rhythm around them, indifferent to the storm that had just passed in a narrow alley. But Mason and everyone who had witnessed the events knew better. They had seen the power of discipline, loyalty, and experience embodied in one extraordinary dog. Rex's amber eyes glinted in the rain, calm yet unyielding. Mason understood fully. The lessons of tonight would echo for a lifetime, not just for the men who had tried to attack the dog, but for Mason himself. Respect, control, and trust were the currency here, and Rex, forged in war, had just taught them all a lesson they would never forget. The alley had been a battlefield, but it had also been a proving ground, and Rex had passed the ultimate test with unwavering perfection. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, leaving the alley slick and shining under the flickering glow of streetlights. Officer Mason knelt beside Rex, hands running through the dog's wet fur. Every muscle in Rex's body radiated power and discipline, yet beneath that strength was a calm loyalty that Mason could feel in his chest. The events of the past hour, the confrontation, the fleeing suspect, the sudden appearance of Rex's handler, had left him shaken, in awe, and forever changed. The three men who had attacked Rex were gone, secured in patrol vehicles, their faces pale and eyes haunted. Mason knew they would never forget this night. The lesson had been delivered in a way that words or courtroom sentences could never replicate. And he realized with a sinking weight that Rex was no ordinary K9. The dog nudged Mason's hand gently, as if reminding him that while the danger had passed, the responsibility remained. Mason exhaled, finally allowing himself to take in the full magnitude of what had happened. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize skill and discipline, but what he had witnessed tonight was beyond anything he had trained for or imagined. The tall man, Rex's handler, was gone, vanished into the shadows of the city like a specter. Mason had caught glimpses of him during the chase, the way he moved, controlled, precise, the way Rex had followed his subtle commands without hesitation. It was a bond that transcended normal understanding, forged in years of combat and life-or-death situations. Mason realized that Rex had carried that bond with him even into the streets of his city, ready to spring into action when needed. As Mason helped Rex to his paws, he felt a profound respect for the dog, not just for his abilities, but for the intelligence, loyalty, and unwavering discipline he had witnessed. This was a partner who had trained under conditions Mason could scarcely imagine, one who had survived battlefields far beyond the city limits, and who had followed a master whose authority was absolute. Rex's eyes scanned the alley, alert but calm, still attuned to danger yet fully obedient to Mason's presence. The officer understood now that every movement, every hesitation, every action was deliberate. This was a dog who had been tested in war, refined through discipline, and now entrusted to him for the streets. Mason felt a mixture of pride, responsibility, and awe. Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens and city noise reminded him that the world was moving forward, oblivious to the events that had just unfolded. He glanced down at Rex and murmured, "You've been through more than anyone should, but you did exactly what you were trained to do." The dog leaned into his touch, acknowledging the praise, yet his amber eyes reflected a depth of experience that Mason could only respect silently. Mason began to walk Rex back toward the cruiser, the wet pavement reflecting their combined presence in the dim streetlight. Each step felt heavy with the realization of what had occurred. He thought of the three men, their arrogance and their ignorance. They had underestimated Rex, and by extension, underestimated the consequences of disrespect. Now, that lesson would linger with them, carved into memory by fear and awe alike. As they approached the patrol car, Mason paused. He looked back down the alley, half expecting to see the handler reappear. But there was only darkness, empty and silent, except for the soft patter of rain. Mason wondered briefly if the man had truly been real or some ghost of Rex's past come to test both dog and officer. But he dismissed the thought. Whatever he was, he had left an indelible mark. Sitting Rex in the back of the cruiser, Mason fastened the leash and sighed. The dog's head rested on his paws, calm and poised, yet Mason could feel the underlying energy coiled within him. This was not a dog who would forget, nor one who would forgive carelessness easily. Mason realized that handling Rex was more than a duty. It was a responsibility to maintain the discipline, loyalty, and respect that had been cultivated over years of war and training. Mason looked up at the night sky, the clouds parting slightly to reveal patches of starlight. "You and your master, you've done enough for tonight," he murmured. "But the city, the streets, they're still ours to protect." Rex gave a low, approving growl, and Mason felt a sense of reassurance. The bond between them had begun to strengthen tonight, forged in the crucible of crisis and tempered by shared understanding. The sound of the city resumed its dominance, the hum of traffic, distant voices, the occasional honk of horns. Yet in that alley something had shifted. Mason knew that the events of tonight would ripple through the precinct, the neighborhoods, and perhaps the lives of those who had witnessed them. Tales of a police dog that seemed more than a dog would spread, and the story would grow, whispered in awe and incredulity. But for Mason, the lesson was personal. He had seen firsthand the extraordinary power of loyalty, training, and respect. He had witnessed the rare bond between a dog and his true handler, a bond that transcended rank, authority, and even life itself. Mason understood in a way he never had before that Rex's strength was not in his teeth or speed, but in his discipline, intelligence, and loyalty, a combination that could never be taught to an ordinary dog. As he closed the cruiser door, Mason gave Rex one last pat. "You're more than a partner, you're a guardian, and we'll make sure everyone knows it in time." The dog's eyes met his, amber and knowing, as if acknowledging the promise. Mason climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The rain had slowed further, leaving only a mist that clung to the air. As the cruiser rolled out of the alley, Mason glanced in the rearview mirror. Rex sat poised and alert, ever vigilant, ever ready. And though the handler was gone, his presence lingered in the discipline, the precision, and the unwavering loyalty of the dog beside him. Tonight, the city had witnessed something extraordinary, but Mason knew this was only the beginning. There would be more tests, more challenges, and more moments that demanded courage, intelligence, and the bond between man and dog. And he knew with absolute certainty that Rex would meet them all, loyal, disciplined, and unbreakable. Because loyalty never leaves. Because some bonds, forged in fire and battle, last a lifetime. And because in the quiet streets of the city, there walked a dog who was more than a police dog. He was a soldier, a guardian, and a legend in his own right.